Heat, heat. At dawn on September 27th, 2020, when the gates of Europe slammed shut. On the border between Poland and Belarus, convoys of over 1,600 cars, 65 buses, and hundreds of freight trains came to a standstill. Armed guards raised steel barriers, and the world's second-largest economy felt the impact instantly. The $25 billion rail corridor linking China's factories in Chongqing, Chengdu, and Xi'an to Europe's markets in Berlin, Paris, and Milan was severed in one decisive move. What unfolded at the Małaszewicze terminal, Poland's critical rail hub, was no routine customs delay. It was the dismantling of Beijing's meticulously crafted Belt and Road Bridge into Europe. Electronics, car parts, and high-tech devices bound for European shelves piled up in Belarusian warehouses. Trains loaded with containers stretched for miles, their cargo of laptops, smartphones, and electric vehicle components, stranded by the closure of just three crossings: Kuznica, Grodno, Semyonovka, Svisloch, and Terespol, Brest. Poland had cut China's fastest overland supply chain, a route that delivered goods in 12 to 14 days compared to 40 days by sea. Factories across China now faced paralyzed assembly lines, breached contracts, and looming penalties worth billions. European importers were left grappling with a chilling question. If Poland could shut down the border in a single morning, what did this mean for the future of global trade? Then the unthinkable happened. Warsaw revealed that this was not merely an economic blockade, it was a geopolitical strike aimed at pressuring Beijing over its tacit support for Russia's war in Ukraine. Overnight, Poland transformed Europe's eastern border into a new front line where economics, politics, and security collided. To grasp the magnitude of this moment, one must look beyond the barbed wire to the broader battlefield. This was not just Poland versus Belarus, it was Europe confronting the vulnerabilities of global trade, and ultimately the West challenging the strategic ambitions of Moscow and Beijing. For years, China had invested billions in its Belt and Road Initiative, promising Europe a faster, cheaper alternative to maritime shipping. Trains departing from inland hubs like Chongqing, Chengdu, and Xi'an traveled thousands of kilometers through Russia and Belarus before reaching the Polish border. This corridor carried everything from microchips to auto parts, forming a logistics chain worth $25 billion annually. Its key advantage was speed. Rail deliveries reached Europe in 2 weeks compared to over a month by sea and at a fraction of the cost of air freight. However, the system's weak link was geography. Nearly 90% of these trains had to pass through a single choke point, the Małaszewicze terminal in eastern Poland, where Asian and European rail systems converged, and thousands of containers were transferred daily. Poland's decision to close this gateway was not random. It struck at the Achilles heel of Beijing's trade empire. Why now? The war in Ukraine had redrawn Europe's security landscape since Russia's invasion in 2022. Belarus, Moscow's closest ally, had enabled hybrid tactics against NATO's eastern flank, including weaponizing migrants along the Polish border. In Warsaw's view, keeping the border open meant allowing hostile regimes to exploit trade routes while undermining European security. The contrast was stark. On one side stood China with its sprawling infrastructure projects and promises of economic stability. On the other stood Poland, a nation of 38 million wielding its geography as a weapon more powerful than tanks or missiles. By halting trains, Warsaw showed that even a mid-sized European state could disrupt the global economy. This moment also exposed a deeper contradiction. Beijing claimed neutrality in Ukraine while quietly supporting Russia and presenting itself as a reliable trade partner to Europe. Poland's blockade forced China to face a harsh reality: trade could no longer be separated from politics. By targeting the Belt and Road's European lifeline, Warsaw demanded that Beijing choose between its economic interests with the EU and its strategic alignment with Moscow. Thus, the closure of a few border crossings became more than a logistical crisis. It was a political earthquake shaking the foundations of alliances, trade routes, and long-standing assumptions about globalization. For the first time, the world saw Poland not as a peripheral state, but as the guardian of Europe's eastern gates. The shockwaves from Poland's decision extended far beyond the border. What began as a sudden halt of freight trains spiraled into a multi-layered crisis, intensifying with each passing hour. The first tremors hit the logistics hubs in Belarus, where thousands of containers were stranded overnight. Railway workers reported entire yards filled with unmoving trains, their cargo exposed to rain theft and decay. Goods worth billions were reduced to steel boxes lined up in silence, waiting for a crossing that would never reopen. In the days that followed, the escalation unfolded in distinct stages. Stage 1, economic paralysis. In China's inland provinces, factories producing laptops, smartphones, and electric vehicle batteries could no longer ship completed orders. Storage warehouses in Chongqing and Xi'an reached capacity. Contracts were breached, penalties multiplied, and the reputation of Chinese goods built on speed and reliability crumbled. European importers accustomed to 12-day deliveries were told to expect delays of up to 6 weeks. Some canceled orders, outright turning to rival suppliers in Southeast Asia. But Stage 2, human displacement. At the borderlines of vehicles stretched for miles, families with children were trapped between checkpoints, their visas useless against steel barricades. Official estimates reported over 600 cars and 65 buses immobilized, but eyewitnesses described tens of thousands forced to turn back. Belarusian security forces blocked highways leading to Poland, leaving travelers stranded in a no-man's land of confusion and frustration. Stage 3, political theater. Warsaw turned its economic chokehold into diplomatic leverage. On September 28, 2025, Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski confronted Chinese diplomat Wang Yi in a tense meeting. Beijing demanded the border be reopened immediately. Poland's response was blunt. Security comes first. If China wanted access to Europe's markets, it had to curb Moscow's aggression and restrain Belarus's hybrid attacks. For the first time in modern history, a mid-tier European power openly challenged China, daring it to choose. Then came the unexpected twists. First, it was revealed that 90% of China-EU rail trade depended on these Polish crossings. The world knew the routes were important, but few realized how fragile the Belt and Road's European artery was. Overnight, Poland proved it could sever Beijing's economic lifeline with a single policy shift. Second, Moscow was rattled. The Kremlin, already strained by Western sanctions and battlefield losses in Ukraine, feared that Beijing might prioritize Europe over their partnership. A crack appeared in the so-called no-limits friendship. Third, Europe itself was transformed. Far from dividing the EU, Poland's bold move rallied support from nations like Lithuania, Latvia, and even Germany, which had long hesitated to confront Beijing. For once, Brussels, Paris, and Berlin followed Warsaw's lead. The message was clear: Europe's eastern flank was no longer just a buffer, it was a center of power. As days turned into weeks, the crisis ceased to be a temporary disruption. It became a geopolitical standoff, testing not only trade flows, but the credibility of global powers. China was cornered, Russia was anxious, and Poland, once dismissed as Europe's periphery, now set the pace of a global confrontation. The closure of Poland's border with Belarus was not just a regional issue, it reshaped the strategic landscape of Europe and beyond. Economically, militarily, and politically, the ripple effects reached from Warsaw to Beijing, Moscow, and Washington. The economic toll was immediate and staggering. According to Reuters and DWW, the China-Europe trade corridor moved goods worth over $25 billion annually. With that pipeline severed, China's inland provinces were hit hardest. Factories in Chongqing, Chengdu, and Xi'an slowed production, cutting shifts and bonuses. For companies reliant on just-in-time delivery, the difference between 12 days by rail and 40 days by sea was catastrophic. Contract penalties piled up into the billions, and the image of Chinese exports as fast and reliable collapsed overnight. For Europe, the losses extended beyond euros to supply chain stability. Industries from German automakers to Italian electronics importers scrambled for alternatives. Rerouting shipments via Kazakhstan, the Caspian Sea, and Turkey was costlier, and delivery times ballooned. By late September, European analysts warned that consumer prices for electronics, auto parts, and medical supplies could rise by 15 to 20% if the blockade persisted. The social consequences were equally severe. As noted by The Guardian, China's Communist Party has long justified its rule through a social contract of economic growth and prosperity. But with assembly lines slowing and layoffs looming, that contract began to crack. The specter of unrest haunted Beijing's leadership, with protests in western provinces sparked by economic uncertainty threatening to spread a nightmare for a government obsessed with stability. Militarily, the move carried strategic weight beyond logistics. Defense News reported that Poland's decision underscored a new doctrine: trade routes are inseparable from security. By targeting the Belt and Road's weakest point, Warsaw weaponized geography as effectively as any missile system. The message to China was clear: if your profits fund Russia's aggression, your trains will stop. For Russia, the implications were dire. Moscow had relied on Chinese economic support to offset Western sanctions and sustain its war in Ukraine. Now its most powerful ally was forced to reconsider the partnership. Analysts from Jane's Defense Weekly argued that this was perhaps the first time Beijing faced tangible costs for its no-limits friendship with the Kremlin. Pressure on Moscow to de-escalate could now come from Beijing itself rather than Washington or Brussels. The geopolitical consequences for Europe were profound. Poland's move showed that small and mid-sized states along NATO's eastern flank were no longer passive buffers, but active players. By unilaterally shutting down a major artery of global trade, Warsaw projected power that Berlin and Paris had hesitated to wield. The symbolism was stark. Europe's security frontier was no longer defined in Brussels, but on the ground at the Polish border. Financially, the reverberations hit global markets. Shipping companies reported surges in sea freight rates, and insurance costs for Eurasian supply chains spiked. The World Bank estimated that if the disruption lasted more than 3 months, China's GDP growth for 2025 could drop by 0.5–0.7%, a blow that would ripple through commodity markets and stock exchanges worldwide. In sum, the strategic impact was threefold. China's economic model was shaken. Russia's war machine was indirectly weakened, and Europe's eastern states emerged as decisive actors in shaping the continent's future. Poland had rewritten the rules, proving that infrastructure and geography could be as potent as armies and weapons. The world was forced to recalibrate its assumptions because one country's decision to close a border had altered the trajectory of global power. The reverberations of Poland's border closure quickly spread beyond Europe, escalating into a global confrontation. At its core was a question: could the international order tolerate trade routes being weaponized? The answer hinged on the reactions of Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and the wider world. For the United States, President Donald Trump's administration seized the moment to reinforce its stance against both China and Russia. As reported by BBC and Reuters, officials in Washington framed Poland's move as a bold act of self-defense that aligned with NATO's deterrence posture. American military analysts emphasized that Poland had exposed a vulnerability often overlooked: logistics are the backbone of modern warfare. By choking off China's Belt and Road artery, Warsaw indirectly struck at Moscow's war economy, as Russian military production still relied on Chinese dual-use exports like microchips and machine tools. The White House publicly praised Poland while quietly accelerating discussions about stationing additional U.S. forces and missile defenses along NATO's eastern flank. In Beijing, the crisis was existential. Chinese policymakers were caught between two imperatives: maintaining the no-limits partnership with Russia and preserving access to Europe, their largest trading partner. State media downplayed the crisis, but the reality was grim. E-commerce giants like Alibaba and Temu, which had built their European strategies on 12 to 14-day delivery windows, were crippled. DW reported that contracts worth billions were at risk. Behind closed doors, China's Ministry of Commerce explored emergency rerouting through Kazakhstan and Turkey, but experts from Jane's Defense Weekly noted these alternatives were slower, costlier, and vulnerable to further disruption. Russia, meanwhile, was cornered. Putin's reliance on Chinese technology and markets had deepened since 2022, but now his ally was under pressure from the very countries he hoped to destabilize. Moscow's rhetoric condemned Warsaw, but insiders admitted fears that Beijing might prioritize trade with the EU over loyalty to the Kremlin. If that happened, Russia could find itself isolated with even fewer avenues to sustain its war in Ukraine. Beyond Europe, the Middle East and Asia took notice. Gulf states, long courted by China through infrastructure and energy deals, questioned whether Beijing could deliver on its promises if a single border closure could disrupt its logistics. In India, analysts noted that New Delhi stood to benefit as delays in Chinese shipments opened opportunities for Indian exports to Europe. The irony was clear: Poland's action had inadvertently tilted the global trade balance in favor of China's rivals. Military experts drew sharp contrasts between doctrines and technologies. Poland's action was likened to using cheap drones against costly fighter jets, asymmetric moves that exploit weaknesses at a fraction of the cost. For years, China had invested heavily in rail corridors, yet a mid-sized European state showed it could all be undone with a political decision and a few closed gates. The lesson for NATO, as highlighted by Defense News, was clear infrastructure security is as critical as missile defense. Looking ahead, analysts outline scenarios for the next 3 to 6 months. In the best case, Beijing would pressure Moscow to curb aggression, leading to a diplomatic easing and gradual reopening of borders. In the worst case, China could double down, rerouting trade through Central Asia and the Middle East, leaving Europe fragmented and vulnerable to new crises. The most likely path was prolonged tension, unstable supply chains, and mounting global costs. The crisis also raised broader questions about globalization. Could the world continue to assume that trade and politics were separate? Poland's move suggested otherwise. By linking security with commerce, Warsaw set a precedent that others, Turkey, India, even the US, might follow. The Belt and Road, once touted as a symbol of interdependence, was exposed as fragile, vulnerable, and deeply political. The events of September 2025 revealed something few had imagined. The balance of global trade, politics, and even warfare could be shifted not by missiles or tanks, but by a single decision at a border crossing. By closing its gates to Belarus, Poland severed the Belt and Road's most critical artery, exposed China's vulnerabilities, and unsettled Russia's most crucial alliance. What seemed like a customs dispute became a defining moment in 21st century geopolitics. For China, the shock was a reminder that its economic rise depends on fragile corridors subject to the politics of others. For Russia, the crisis proved that even its most loyal ally could not shield it from the consequences of a grueling war in Ukraine. For Europe, it was a turning point. The eastern flank was no longer a buffer, but a decisive actor capable of reshaping the continent's security doctrine. For the United States, it was an opportunity to reinforce NATO's eastward posture, applauding Poland's resolve as a model of frontline resilience. Yet beneath the triumph and defiance lies tragedy. Thousands of travelers stranded at border checkpoints, workers in Chinese factories losing income, and European companies scrambling to meet demand are reminders that geopolitics is never abstract. It is measured in disrupted livelihoods, broken contracts, and families caught in the crossfire of decisions made thousands of miles away. The shock, however, is undeniable. A nation of 38 million leveraged geography to paralyze the world's second-largest economy. The precedent is set. Infrastructure and trade are no longer safe from the logic of war and politics. The question now is not whether the rules of globalization have changed, they have, but how the world will adapt. Will Poland's gamble force China to pressure Moscow, hastening an end to the war in Ukraine? Or will Beijing double down, sacrificing the European market to preserve its strategic partnership with Russia? Could this crisis mark the start of a fragmented global economy where trade routes are perpetually vulnerable to political disputes? The answers remain uncertain. What is certain is that Poland's bold strike will be studied for years as a case where geography became power and a single border became the stage for a global showdown. What do you think? Has Poland changed the future of globalization forever? Will China prioritize trade over loyalty to Moscow? How will Washington and NATO respond if similar choke points emerge elsewhere? Share your thoughts in the comments below. To follow every new chapter in this unfolding story, subscribe now.